Okay, so this is interdependence, section 1.2. So no species can survive by itself. Species survive in an ecosystem and they are dependent upon one another. So an example of this was the food chain we talked about in class where we had, let's say we had phytoplankton, and the smaller fish would prey upon the phytoplankton and larger fish would prey upon the smaller fish, and the bald eagle would kind of swoop down and eat the larger fish. This shows that organisms are dependent upon one another. And in this slide picture here, we can see that we have a bee that's getting the nectar from the flower here. But if you look closely at the bee has pollen from the flower, which when it flies away and it eventually gets nectar from another flower, it deposits the pollen into that flower, thereby allowing the flowers to reproduce. So that's why they depend on one another. So interdependence, these are the learner outcomes. You can pause the video and read that. This is a very important concept. Again, it's a tomato-tomato type of thing. Niches or niches. I'll just say that they're niches. What are niches? So basically, when you hear the word niche, you need to kind of think about what the organism's overall role or overall job is in an ecosystem. And the overall job is not just, okay, it's not just what an organism does, but it's several things that is involved in a niche. So the niche is the role of an organism within a particular system, and this diagram shows nicely that there are many things that organisms can do with respect to one another. So here's what a niche includes. A niche is going to include what the organism eats, its habitat, okay? In other words, where it lives, its nesting site, which is the same thing, and with respect to its habitat, you're always going to find organisms that are going to live within a range, okay? Within a certain range of land or area in which you're going to find organisms live, okay? So what effect it has on other populations? Okay, so for example, if it's a predator, it is going to go ahead and it's going to eat prey, and it's going to decrease the population of the prey. So for example, if you introduce wolves at Yellowstone Park, well, they are going to kill off the deer. The deer population will decrease, and that is how they affect the deer population. Okay, but that interaction is more complicated than that. What effect it has on the environment? Okay, and if you consider yourself, you also have an itch, right? You also live in a certain place, you go to a certain school, you might have a job, you eat certain foods, you do not eat certain foods, you have a certain temperature you feel comfortable with and influences. So we all have niches. Okay, so there are different interdependencies. Okay, there are different kinds of relationships among organisms, and we're going to talk a little bit about what they are. There are three major types we kind of talked about in class, and they're all characterized as symbiosis. Symbiosis means together. Sym means together, biosis means life. So symbiosis is just an examination of how species interact, and there are a few types of symbiosis. How you distinguish between the different types of symbiotic relationship is pretty simple. All you need to do is just answer this question here. That's all you got to do. Does an organism benefit from a relationship or is it harmed? In a symbiotic relationship, at least one organism must be benefited somehow. So the first one we're going to talk about is commensalism. In a commensalism relationship, one benefits and the other one is neither benefited nor harmed. So in this example here, we have birds that are making their nest in a tree. So here's the bird's nest, and the birds lays their eggs, The bird has the advantage. It benefits because it gets a place to store its eggs and it gets a place to kind of call a habitat. Okay, the tree in which the bird makes its nest and lays its eggs is not affected at all. It's neither harmed nor is it benefited. So it's a commensalism relationship. Okay, here's another example of commensalism. This is a whale. Okay, but if you look on the surface of the whale, it's got these whole bunch of little things kind of attached to them. And what they are is they're actually barnacles. Okay, they're barnacles. And what barnacles are is they're kind of a cephalopod. In other words, they're categorized in the same way as crab or lobster or anything. And these guys get a really big advantage of being able to attach to a whale because they're filter feeders. So they're going to eat off the plankton in the ocean, and when the whale goes through the water, it has the barnacles. They get water just going through them, and they can filter out the phytoplankton. So they get a constant source of food. Also, they get a free ride, right? So when they're attached to the back of the whales or onto the whales, they're not mobile, so they're not stuck onto anything that's stationary. That makes them susceptible to being eaten, being preyed upon. This way, it's harder for prey to eat them. Mutualism is when both organisms benefit. Here it's just the same thing as at the very beginning. You have a pollinator that gets nectar, and you have a flower that is able to be reproduced because of the pollinator. This is an example of mutualism. Okay, this is what's called a Nile crocodile, and this is called the Egyptian plover bird. So the Egyptian plover bird is going to go ahead and it's going to actually pick at the teeth of the crocodile, and it's going to actually nibble and take away food, right? That from the crocodile's previous meals. This ensures that the crocodile doesn't get any teeth infection, and the plover bird gets a meal. So that's a mutualistic relationship. And by the way, the crocodile does not kill the plover bird. Okay, parasitism. We talked about this one in class. Mosquito gets blood. The human or the other animal that it bites gets its skin irritated. So that's an example where the mosquito benefits, but the other one is harmed. That's a parasitism. The mosquito is considered to be a parasite. So here you can go ahead and study this this chart. You can pause the video. Interspecies competition is when two or more species need the same resource. Okay, so interspecies, just kind of think about it in terms of being international, right? So international, you have, let's say, one country, and then in between country A, you got, I don't know, the ocean or whatever, that's supposed to be water. And then you have another country, right? And so that is international, right, between countries and stuff like that. It's the same sort of thing with interspecies competition. That's just competition that happens between two different species for the same resource. For example, you can have coyotes and foxes that might be competing for rabbits. Okay, so here's an example of interspecies competition where you have gazelles and zebra that are, fed on by lions and perhaps hyenas when they get into packs, go ahead and compete for the lion, compete against the lions for the same food source. So if two species compete, you get into a situation where one might outcompete the other, creating decrease in population of the one who is losing. Okay. A way to avoid this, there are some more examples of commensalism that we talked about. Mutualism we talked about, you can check those out. Parasitism, we talked about tapeworms. Okay. So cohabitation. Cohabitation just means that species live within a common place and use the same resources. So they figured out a way to use the same resources. So for example, these organisms all use the same resource, but they figured out a way to kind of coexist and gain access to the resources as well. Okay, this is a big term that you're going to have to know. Hint, hint, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. This is a big deal. Resource partitioning. So all resource partitioning is, it's just they compete for the same resources, but what they do is they access these resources in a different way. Um, that minimizes the amount of competition. So a typical example that's in your textbook, and a really good example that'll definitely I think will be on exams and perhaps on the PAT, is this whole idea with the warbler species of birds. With the warbler species of birds, they all compete for the same food source. They all um, compete for a certain, so I believe it's certain insects, I'm not too sure. But if you look at the distribution of the warbler species throughout, you know, the height of this, let's say the spruce tree, for example, um, these species here will access food at lower levels of the tree. This one more towards the middle, and then you have these species of birds that access the same resource for food at the top part of the tree. Because they are accessing the same resource at different levels of the tree, the competition is minimized. They're not competing as much because they're accessing the resources in slightly different areas. That's called resource partitioning. Okay, and that's something you definitely need to know. Okay, and there's just another slide showing the same thing. Okay, and that's really all I have to say for this presentation. There are going to be multiple choice exam questions here we can go through as practice, but we'll probably talk about them in class instead of just going through them here. So that's it, and I hope this was helpful.